Welcome to BTC Radio Audiobook and ASMR, the ultimate destination for audiobook enthusiasts and literary explorers. If you're someone who finds solace in the symphony of words, if you yearn to get lost in captivating tales spun by master storytellers, then you've just discovered your haven. Join us on a journey where pages come to life through the power of sound, where every narrative nuance and character emotion is vividly painted in the theater of your mind. From timeless classics to contemporary gems, our channel is a sanctuary for those who believe that stories are meant to be heard. So, sit back, close your eyes, and let the magic of words transport you to distant worlds, one audiobook at a time.
The Secret of Chimneys is a work of detective fiction, by British writer Agatha Christie, first published in the UK by the Bodley Head in June 1925, and in the US by Dodd Mead and Company later in the same year. The longest living author of this work died in 1976, so this work is in the public domain in countries and areas where the copyright term is the author's life plus 46 years or less. This work may be in the public domain in countries and areas with longer native copyright terms, that apply the rule of the shorter term to foreign works. The Secret of Chimneys by Agatha Christie, Part 1.
Chapter 1. Anthony Cade signs on. Gentleman Joe! Why, if it isn't old Jimmy McGrath! Castle Select Tour, represented by 7 depressed-looking females and 3 perspiring males, looked on with considerable interest. Evidently there Mr. Cade had met an old friend. They all admired Mr. Cade so much. His tall, lean figure, his sun-tanned face, the light-hearted manner with which he settled disputes and cajoled them all into good temper. This friend of his now, surely rather a peculiar-looking man. About the same height as Mr. Cade, but thick-set and not nearly so good-looking. The sort of man one read about in books, who probably kept a saloon. Interesting, though. After all, that was what one came abroad for, to see all these peculiar things one read about in books. Up to now they had been rather bored with Bulawayo. The sun was unbearably hot. The hotel was uncomfortable. There seemed to be nowhere particular to go, until the moment should arrive to motor to the Matterpos. Very fortunately, Mr. Cade had suggested picture postcards. There was an excellent supply of picture postcards. Anthony Cade and his friend had stepped a little apart. "What the hell are you doing with this pack of females?" demanded McGrath. "Starting a harem?" "Not with this little lot," grinned Anthony. "Have you taken a good look at them?" "I have that. Thought maybe you were losing your eyesight." "My eyesight's as good as ever it was. No, this is a Castle's Select Tour. I'm Castle. The local Castle, I mean." "What the hell made you take on a job like that?" "A regrettable necessity for cash. I assure you it doesn't suit my temperament." Jimmy grinned. "Never a hog for regular work, were you?" Anthony ignored this aspersion. "However, something will turn up soon, I expect," he remarked hopefully. "It usually does." Jimmy chuckled. "If there's any trouble brewing, Anthony Cade is sure to be in it sooner or later, I know that," he said. "You've an absolute instinct for rows, and the 9 lives of a cat. When can we have a yarn together?" Anthony sighed. "I've got to take these cackling hens to see Rhodes' grave." "Now that's the stuff," said Jimmy approvingly. "They'll come back bumped black and blue with the ruts in the road and clamouring for bed to rest the bruises on. Then you and I will have a spot or two and exchange the news." "Right. So long, Jimmy." Anthony rejoined his flock of sheep. Miss Taylor, the youngest and most skittish of the party, instantly attacked him. "Oh, Mr. Cade, was that an old friend of yours?" "It was, Miss Taylor. One of the friends of my blameless youth." Miss Taylor giggled. "Oh, I thought he was such an interesting-looking man." "I'll tell him you said so." "Oh, Mr. Cade, how can you be so naughty? The very idea. What was that name he called you?" "Gentleman Joe?" "Yes. Is your name Joe?" I thought you knew it was Anthony, Miss Taylor. Oh, go on with you, cried Miss Taylor coquettishly. Anthony had by now well mastered his duties. In addition to making the necessary arrangements of travel, they included soothing down irritable old gentlemen when their dignity was ruffled, seeing that elderly matrons had ample opportunities to buy picture postcards, and flirting with everything under a Catholic 40 years of age. The last task was rendered easier for him by the extreme readiness of the ladies in question to read a tender meaning into his most innocent remarks. Miss Taylor returned to the attack. "Why does he call you Joe, then?" "Oh, just because it isn't my name." "And why Gentleman Joe?" "Oh, the same kind of reason." "Oh, Mr. Cade," protested Miss Taylor, much distressed. "I'm sure you shouldn't say that. Papa was only saying last night what gentlemanly manners you had." "Oh, very kind of your father, I'm sure, Miss Taylor." "And we're all agreed that you are quite the gentleman." "I'm overwhelmed." "No, really, I mean it." "Kind hearts are more than coronets," said Anthony vaguely, without a notion of what he meant by the remark, and wishing fervently it was lunchtime. "That's such a beautiful poem, I always think. Do you know much poetry, Mr. Cade?" "Well, I might recite 'The boy stood on the burning deck' at a pinch. 'The boy stood on the burning deck, whence all but he had fled.' Oh, that's all I know. But I can do that bit with action, if you like. 'The boy stood on the burning deck, whoosh, whoosh, whoosh,' the flames, you see, whence all but he had fled. For that bit, I run to and fro like a dog." Miss Taylor screamed with laughter. "Oh, do look at Mr. Cade. Isn't he funny?" "Time for morning tea," said Anthony briskly. "Come this way. There is an excellent cafe in the next street." "I presume," said Mrs. Caldecott in her deep voice, "that the expense is included in the tour?" "A morning tea, Mrs. Caldecott," said Anthony, assuming his professional manner, "is an extra." "Disgraceful!" "Life is full of trials, isn't it?" said Anthony cheerfully. Mrs. Caldecott's eyes gleamed, and she remarked, with the air of one springing a mine, "I suspected as much, and in anticipation I poured off some tea into a jug at breakfast this morning. I could heat that up on the spirit lamp. Come, father." Mr. and Mrs. Caldecott sailed off triumphantly to the hotel, the ladies back complacent with successful forethought. "Oh, Lord," muttered Anthony, "what a lot of funny people it does take to make a world." He marshalled the rest of the party in the direction of the cafe. Miss Taylor kept by his side and resumed her catechism. "Is it a long time since you saw your friend?" "Oh, just over 7 years." "Was it in Africa that you knew him?" "Yes, not this part, though. The first time I ever saw Jimmy McGrath, he was all trussed up ready for the cooking pot. Some of the tribes in the interior are cannibals, you know. We got there just in time." "Oh, what happened?" "Very nice little shindy. We potted some of the beggars, and the rest took to their heels." "Oh, Mr. Cade, what an adventurous life you must have led." "Very peaceful, I assure you." But it was clear that the lady did not believe him. It was about 10 o'clock that night when Anthony Cade walked into the small room where Jimmy McGrath was busy manipulating various bottles. "Make it strong, James," he implored. "I can tell you, I need it." "I should think you did, my boy. I wouldn't take on that job of yours for anything." "Show me another, and I'll jump out of it fast enough." McGrath poured out his own drink, tossed it off with a practised hand, and mixed a second one. Then he said slowly, "Are you in earnest about that, old son?" "About what?" "Chucking this job of yours, if you could get another." "Why? You don't mean to say you've got a job going begging?" "Why don't you grab it yourself?" "I have grabbed it, but I don't much fancy it. That's why I'm trying to pass it on to you." Anthony became suspicious. "Well, what's wrong with it? They haven't engaged you to teach in a Sunday school, have they?" "Do you think anyone would choose me to teach in a Sunday school?" "Not if they knew you well, certainly." "It's a perfectly good job. Nothing wrong with it whatsoever." "Not in South America, by any lucky chance?" "I've rather got my eye on South America. There's a very tidy little revolution coming off in one of those little republics soon." McGrath grinned. "You were always keen on revolutions. Anything to be mixed up in a really good row." "I feel my talents might be appreciated out there. I tell you, Jimmy, I can be jolly useful in a revolution, to one side or the other. It's better than making an honest living any day." I think I've heard that sentiment from you before, my son. No, the job isn't in South America. It's in England. England? Return of hero to his native land after many long years. They can't dun you for bills after 7 years, can they, Jimmy? I don't think so. Well, are you on for hearing more about it? Oh, I'm on all right. The thing that worries me is why you're not taking it on yourself. I'll tell you. I'm after gold, Anthony, far up in the interior. Anthony whistled and looked at him. You've always been after gold, Jimmy. Ever since I knew you, it's your weak spot, your own particular little hobby. You've followed up more wildcat trails than anyone I know. And in the end, I'll strike it. You'll see. Well, everyone has his own hobby. Mine's rows. Yours is gold. I'll tell you the whole story. I suppose you know all about Hercule. Anthony looked up sharply. Hercule, he said, with a curious ring in his voice. Yes. Know anything about it? There was quite an appreciable pause before Anthony answered. Then he said slowly, Well, only what everyone knows. It's one of the Balkan states, isn't it? Principal rivers, unknown. Principal mountains, also unknown, but fairly numerous. Capital, Bucharest. Population, chiefly brigands. Hobby, assassinating kings and having revolutions. Last king, Nicholas IV, assassinated about 7 years ago. Since then, it's been a republic. Altogether a very likely spot. You might have mentioned before that Hercule came into it. It doesn't, except indirectly. Anthony gazed at him more in sorrow than in anger. You ought to do something about this, James, he said. Take a correspondence course or something. If you'd told a story like this in the good old Eastern days, you'd have been hung up by the heels and bastinadoed or something equally unpleasant. Jimmy pursued this course quite unmoved by these strictures. Ever heard of Count Stilptich? Now you're talking, said Anthony. Many people who have never heard of Hercule would brighten at the mention of Count Stilptich, the grand old man of the Balkans, the greatest statesman of modern times, the biggest villain unhung. The point of view all depends on which newspaper you take in. But be sure of this, Count Stilptich will be remembered long after you and I are dust and ashes, James. Every move and countermove in the Near East for the last 20 years has had Count Stilptich at the bottom of it. He's been a dictator and a patriot and a statesman. And nobody knows exactly what he has been, except that he's been a perfect king of intrigue. Well, what about him? He was Prime Minister of Hercule. That's why I mentioned it first. You've no sense of proportion, Jimmy. Hercule is of no importance at all compared to Stilptich. It just provided him with a birthplace and a post in public affairs. But I thought he was dead. So he is. He died in Paris about 2 months ago. What I'm telling you about happened some years ago. Well, the question is, said Anthony, what are you telling me about? Jimmy accepted the rebuke and hastened on. It was like this. I was in Paris, just 4 years ago to be exact. I was walking along one night in a rather lonely part when I saw half a dozen French toughs beating up a respectable-looking old gentleman. I hate a one-sided show, so I promptly butted in and proceeded to beat up the toughs. I guess they'd never been hit really hard before. They melted like snow. Good for you, James, said Anthony softly. I'd like to have seen that scrap. Oh, it was nothing much, said Jimmy modestly. But the old boy was no end grateful. He'd had a couple, no doubt about that. But he was sober enough to get my name and address out of me, and he came along and thanked me next day. Did the thing in style, too. It was then that I found out it was Count Stilptich I'd rescued. He'd got a house up by the Bois. Anthony nodded. Yes, Stilptich went to live in Paris after the assassination of King Nicholas. They wanted him to come back and be president later, but he wasn't taking any. He remained sound to his monarchical principles, though he was reported to have his finger in all the backstairs pies that went on in the Balkans. Very deep, the late Count Stilptich. Nicholas IV was the man who had a funny taste in wives, wasn't he? Said Jimmy suddenly. Yes, said Anthony. And it did for him too, poor beggar. She was some little gutter-snipe of a musical artiste in Paris, not even suitable for a morganatic alliance. But Nicholas had a frightful crush on her, and she was all out for being a queen. Sounds fantastic, but they managed it somehow. Called her the Countess Popovsky or something, and pretended she had Romanov blood in her veins. Nicholas married her in the cathedral to take a rest, with a couple of unwilling archbishops to do the job, and she was crowned as Queen Varaga. Nicholas squared his ministers, and I suppose he thought that was all that mattered. But he forgot to reckon with the populace. They're very aristocratic and reactionary in Czechoslovakia. They like their kings and queens to be the genuine article. There were mutterings and discontent and the usual ruthless suppressions, and the final uprising, which stormed the palace, murdered the king and queen and proclaimed a republic. It's been a republic ever since. But things still manage to be pretty lively there, or so I've heard. They've assassinated a president or two just to keep their hand in, but revenons à nos moutons. You'd got to where Count Stilptich was hailing you as his preserver. Yes. Well, that was the end of that business. I came back to Africa and never thought of it again until about 2 weeks ago I got a queer-looking parcel which had been following me all over the place for the Lord knows how long. I'd seen in a paper that Count Stilptich had recently died in Paris. Well, this parcel contained his memoirs, or reminiscences, or whatever you call the things. There was a note enclosed to the effect that if I delivered the manuscript at a certain firm of publishers in London on or before October 13th, they were instructed to hand me £1,000. £1,000? Did you say £1,000, Jimmy? I did, my son. I hope to God it's not a hoax. Put not your trust in princes or politicians, as the saying goes. Well, there it is. Owing to the way the manuscript had been following me around, I had no time to lose. It was a pity, all the same. I'd just fixed up this trip to the interior, and I'd set my heart on going. I shan't get such a good chance again. You're incurable, Jimmy. £1,000 in the hand is worth a lot of mythical gold, and supposing it's all a hoax. Anyway, here I am, passage booked and everything, on the way to Cape Town, and then you blow along. Anthony got up and lit a cigarette. I begin to perceive your drift, James. You go gold hunting as planned, and I collect the £1,000 for you. How much do I get out of it? What do you say to a quarter? £250 free of income tax, as the saying goes. That's it. Done. And just to make you gnash your teeth, I'll tell you that I would have gone for 100. Let me tell you, James McGrath, you won't die in your bed counting up your bank balance. Anyway, it's a deal? It's a deal, all right. I'm on. And confusion to Castle Select Tours. They drank the toast solemnly. Chapter 2. A Lady in Distress. So that's that, said Anthony, finishing off his glass and replacing it on the table. What boat were you going on? Granarth Castle. Passage booked in your name, I suppose. So I'd better travel as James McGrath. We've outgrown the passport business, haven't we? No odds either way. You and I are totally unlike, but we'd probably have the same description on one of those blinking things. Height 6 feet, hair brown, eyes blue, nose ordinary, chin ordinary. Not so much of this ordinary stunt. Let me tell you that Castle selected me out of several applicants solely on account of my pleasing appearance and nice manners. Jimmy grinned. I noticed your manners this morning. The devil you did. Anthony rose and paced up and down the room. His brow was slightly wrinkled, and it was some minutes before he spoke. Jimmy, he said at last, Stilptich died in Paris. What's the point of sending a manuscript from Paris to London via Africa? Jimmy shook his head helplessly. I don't know. Why not do it up in a nice little parcel and send it by post? Sounds a damn sight more sensible, I agree. Of course, continued Anthony, I know that kings and queens and government officials are prevented by etiquette from doing anything in a simple, straightforward fashion, hence king's messengers and all that. In medieval days, you gave a fellow a signet ring as a sort of open sesame. The king's ring, pass, my lord. And usually it was the other fellow who had stolen it. I always wonder why some bright lad never hit on the expedient of copying the ring, making a dozen or so, and selling them at 100 ducats apiece. They seem to have had no initiative in the Middle Ages. Jimmy yawned. My remarks on the Middle Ages don't seem to amuse you. Let's get back to Count Stilptich. From France to England via Africa, Seems a bit thick, even for a diplomatic personage. If he merely wanted to ensure that you should get £1,000, he could have left it to you in his will. Thank God neither you nor I are too proud to accept a legacy. Stilptitch must have been balmy. You'd think so, wouldn't you? Anthony frowned and continued his pacing. Have you read the thing at all? He asked suddenly. Read what? The manuscript. Good Lord, no. Why do you think I want to read a thing of that kind for? Anthony smiled. I just wondered, that's all. You know, a lot of trouble has been caused by memoirs. Indiscreet revelations, that sort of thing. People who have been close as an oyster all their lives seem positively to relish causing trouble when they themselves shall be comfortably dead. It gives them a kind of malicious glee. Jimmy, what sort of a man was Count Stilptitch? You met him and talked to him? You're a pretty good judge of raw human nature. Can you imagine him being a vindictive old devil? Jimmy shook his head. Well, it's difficult to tell. You see, that first night he was distinctly canned, and the next day he was just a high-toned old boy with the most beautiful manners, overwhelming me with compliments, till I didn't know where to look. And he didn't say anything interesting when he was drunk. Jimmy cast his mind back, wrinkling his brows as he did so. He said he knew where the Kohinoor was, he volunteered doubtfully. Oh, well, said Anthony, we all know that. They keep it in the tower, don't they? Behind thick plate glass and iron bars with a lot of gentlemen in fancy dress standing round to see you don't pinch anything. That's right, agreed Jimmy. Did Stilptitch say anything else of the same kind? That he knew which city the Wallace collection was in, for instance? Jimmy shook his head. Said Anthony. He lit another cigarette and once more began pacing up and down the room. You never read the papers, I suppose, you heathen? He threw out presently. Not very often, said McGrath simply. They're not about anything that interests me as a rule. Thank heaven I'm more civilized. There have been several mentions of Czechoslovakia lately, hints at a royalist restoration. Nicholas IV didn't leave a son, said Jimmy, but I don't suppose for a minute that the Abolovich dynasty is extinct. There are probably shoals of young-uns knocking about. Cousins and second cousins and third cousins once removed. So that there wouldn't be any difficulty in finding a king. Not in the least, I should say, replied Jimmy. You know, I don't wonder if they're getting tired of republican institutions. A full-blooded, virile people like that must find it awfully tame to pot at presidents after being used to kings. And talking of kings, that reminds me of something else old Stilptitch let out that night. He said he knew the gang that was after him. They were King Victor's people, he said. What? Anthony wheeled round suddenly. A short grin widened on McGrath's face. Just a mite excited, aren't you, Gentleman Joe? He drawled. Don't be an ass, Jimmy. You've just said something rather important. He went over to the window and stood there looking out. Who is this King Victor, anyway? Demanded Jimmy. Another Balkan monarch? No, said Anthony slowly. He isn't that kind of a king. What is he, then? There was a pause, and then Anthony spoke. He's a crook, Jimmy. The most notorious jewel thief in the world. A fantastic, daring fellow, not to be daunted by anything. King Victor was the nickname he was known by in Paris. Paris was the headquarters of his gang. They caught him there and put him away for 7 years on a minor charge. They couldn't prove the more important things against him. He'll be out soon, or he may be out already. Do you think Count Stilptitch had anything to do with putting him away? Was that why the gang went for him? Out of revenge? I don't know, said Anthony. It doesn't seem likely on the face of it. King Victor never stole the crown jewels of Czechoslovakia, as far as I've heard. But the whole thing seems rather suggestive, doesn't it? The death of Stilptitch, the memoirs, and the rumours in the papers, all vague but interesting. And there's a further rumour to the effect that they've found oil in Czechoslovakia. I've a feeling in my bones, James, that people are getting ready to be interested in that unimportant little country. What sort of people? Financiers, in city offices. What are you driving at with all this? Trying to make an easy job difficult, that's all. You can't pretend there's going to be any difficulty in handing over a simple manuscript at a publisher's office." "No," said Anthony regretfully. "I don't suppose there'll be anything difficult about that. But I shall tell you, James, where I propose to go with my £250. South America? No, my lad. Hercule. I shall stand in with the Republic, I think. Very probably, I shall end up as president. Why not announce yourself as the Principal Abolovitch and be king whilst you're about it? No, Jimmy. Kings are for life. Presidents only take on the job for 4 years or so. It would quite amuse me to govern a kingdom like Hercule for 4 years." "The average for kings is even less, I should say," interpolated Jimmy. "It'll probably be a serious temptation to me to embezzle your share of the £1,000. You won't want it, you know, when you get back weighed down with nuggets. I'll invest it for you in Hercule oil shares. You know, James, the more I think of it, the more pleased I am with this idea of yours. I should never have thought of Hercule if you hadn't mentioned it. I shall spend 1 day in London collecting the booty, and then away by the Balkan Express. You won't get off quite as fast as that. I didn't mention it before, but I've got another little commission for you." Anthony sank into a chair and eyed him severely. "I knew all along that you were keeping something dark. This is where the catch comes in. Not a bit. It's just something that's got to be done, to help a lady. Once and for all, James, I refuse to be mixed up in your beastly love affairs. It's not a love affair. I'd never seen the woman. I'll tell you the whole story. If I've got to listen to more of your long, rambling stories, I shall have to have another drink." His host complied hospitably with his demand, and then began the tale. "It was when I was up in Uganda. There was a man there whose life I'd saved. If I were you, Jimmy, I should write a short book entitled Lives I Have Saved. That's the second I've heard of this evening." "Oh, well, I didn't really do anything this time. Just pull the feller out of the river. He couldn't swim." "Wait a minute. Has this story anything to do with the other business?" "Oh, nothing whatever. Though, oddly enough, now I remember it, the man was a Hercule. We always called him Dutch Pedro, though." Anthony nodded indifferently. "Get on with the good work, James." "Well, the fellow was sort of grateful about it. Hung around like a dog. About 6 months later, he died of fever. I was with him. Last thing, just as he was pegging out, he beckoned me and whispered some excited jargon about a secret, a gold mine, I thought he said. Shoved an oilskin packet into my hand, which he'd always worn next to his skin. Well, I didn't think much of it at the time. It wasn't until a week afterwards that I opened the packet. Then I was curious, I must confess. I shouldn't have thought that Dutch Pedro would have had the sense to know a gold mine when he saw it. But there's no accounting for luck. And at the mere thought of gold, your heart beat pit-a-pat, as always," interrupted Anthony. "I was never so disgusted in my life. Gold mine, indeed. I dare say it may have been a gold mine to him, the dirty dog. Do you know what it was? A woman's letters. Yes, a woman's letters, and an Englishwoman at that. The skunk had been blackmailing her, and he had the impudence to pass on his dirty bag of tricks to me. I like to see your righteous heat, James. But you had saved his life. He bequeathed to you a profitable source of raising money. Your high-minded British ideals did not enter his horizon. Well, what the hell was I to do with the things? Burn them? That's what I thought at first. And then it occurred to me that there would be that poor dame not knowing they'd been destroyed, and always living in a quake and a dread lest Dutch Pedro should turn up again one day. You've more imagination than I gave you credit for, Jimmy," observed Anthony, lighting a cigarette. "I admit that the case presented more difficulties than were at first apparent. What about just sending them to her by post? Well, like all women, she'd put no date and no address on most of the letters. There was a kind of address on one, just one word. Chimneys." Anthony paused, in the act of blowing out his match, and he dropped it with a quick jerk of the wrist as it burned his finger. "Chimneys?" he said. "That's rather extraordinary." "Why? Do you know it?" "It's one of the stately homes of England, my dear James, a place where kings and queens go for weekends, and diplomatists foregather and diplome." "Well, that's one of the reasons why I'm so glad that you're going to England instead of me. You know all these things," said Jimmy simply. A josser like myself from the backwoods of Canada would be making all sorts of bloomers, but someone like you who's been to Eton and Harrow, only one of them, said Anthony modestly, will be able to carry it through. Why didn't I send them to her, you say? Well, it seemed to me dangerous. From what I could make out, she seemed to have a jealous husband. Suppose he opened the letter by mistake. Where would the poor dame be then? Or she might be dead. The letters looked as though they'd been written some time. As I figured it out, the only thing was for someone to take them to England and put them into her own hands. Anthony threw away his cigarette and, coming across to his friend, clapped him affectionately on the back. You're a real knight-errant, Jimmy, he said, and the backwoods of Canada should be proud of you. I shan't do the job half as prettily as you would. You'll take it on, then? Of course. McGrath rose, and going across to a drawer, took out a bundle of letters and threw them on the table. Here you are. You'd better have a look at them. Is it necessary? On the whole, I'd rather not. Well, from what you say about this Chimneys place, she may have been staying there only. We'd better look through the letters, and see if there's any clue as to where she really hangs out. I suppose you're right. They went through the letters carefully, but without finding what they had hoped to find. Anthony gathered them up again thoughtfully. Poor little devil, he remarked. She was scared stiff. Jimmy nodded. Do you think you'll be able to find her all right? He asked anxiously. I won't leave England till I have. You're very concerned about this unknown lady, James. Jimmy ran his finger thoughtfully over the signature. It's a pretty name, he said apologetically. Virginia Revel. Chapter 3. Anxiety in High Places. Oh, quite so, my dear fellow, quite so, said Lord Caterham. He had used the same words 3 times already, each time in the hope that they would end the interview and permit him to escape. He disliked very much being forced to stand on the steps of the exclusive London club to which he belonged and listen to the interminable eloquence of the Honourable George Lomax. Clement Edward Alistair Brent, 9th Marquis of Caterham, was a small gentleman, shabbily dressed and entirely unlike the popular conception of a marquis. He had faded blue eyes, a thin, melancholy nose, and a vague but courteous manner. The principal misfortune of Lord Caterham's life was to have succeeded his brother, the 8th Marquis, 4 years ago. For the previous Lord Caterham had been a man of mark, a household word all over England. At one time Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, he had always bulked largely in the councils of the Empire, and his country seat, Chimneys, was famous for its hospitality. Ably seconded by his wife, the daughter of the Duke of Perth, history had been made and unmade at informal weekend parties at Chimneys, and there was hardly anyone of note in England, or indeed in Europe, who had not at one time or another stayed there. That was all very well. The 9th Marquis of Caterham had the utmost respect and esteem for the memory of his brother. Henry had done that kind of thing magnificently. What Lord Caterham objected to was the assumption that Chimneys was a national possession, rather than a private country house. There was nothing that bored Lord Caterham more than politics, unless it was politicians. Hence his impatience under the continued eloquence of George Lomax. A robust man, George Lomax inclined to embonpoint, with a red face and protuberant eyes and an immense sense of his own importance. You see the point, Caterham. We simply can't afford a scandal of any kind just now. The position is one of the utmost delicacy. It always is, said Lord Caterham, with a flavour of irony. My dear fellow, I'm in a position to know. Oh, quite so, said Lord Caterham, falling back upon his previous line of defence. One slip over this Czechoslovakian business and we're done. It is most important that the oil concessions should be granted to a British company who must see that. Of course. Prince Michael Abolovitch arrives at the end of the week, and the whole thing can be carried through at Chimneys under the guise of a shooting party. I was thinking of going abroad this week, said Lord Caterham. Nonsense, my dear Caterham, no one goes abroad in early October. My doctor seems to think I'm in rather a bad way, said Lord Caterham, longingly eyeing a taxi that was crawling past. He was quite unable to make a dash for liberty, however, since Lomax had the unpleasant habit of retaining a hold upon a person with whom he was engaged in serious conversation, doubtless the result of long experience. In this case he had a firm grip of the lapel of Lord Caterham's coat. "My dear man, I put it to you imperially. In a moment of national crisis, such as is fast approaching—" Lord Caterham wriggled uneasily. He felt suddenly that he would rather give any number of house parties than listen to George Lomax quoting from one of his own speeches. He knew by experience that Lomax was quite capable of going on for 20 minutes without a stop. "All right," he said hastily, "I'll do it. You'll arrange the whole thing, I suppose?" "My dear fellow, there's nothing to arrange. Chimneys, quite apart from its historic associations, is ideally situated. I shall be at the Abbey, less than 7 miles away. It wouldn't do, of course, for me to be actually a member of the house party." "Oh, of course not," agreed Lord Caterham, who had no idea why it would not do, and was not interested to learn. "Perhaps you wouldn't mind having Bill Eversley, though. He'd be useful to run messages." "Oh, delighted," said Lord Caterham, with a shade more animation. "Bill's quite a decent shot, and Bundle likes him." "The shooting, of course, is not really important. It's only the pretext, as it were." Lord Caterham looked depressed again. "That'll be all, then. The Prince, his suite, Bill Eversley, Herman Isaacstein." "Who?" "Herman Isaacstein, the representative of the syndicate I spoke to you about." "Oh, the all-British syndicate?" "Yes, why?" "Oh, nothing. I only wondered, that's all. Curious names these people have." "Then, of course, there ought to be 1 or 2 outsiders, just to give the thing a bona fide appearance. Lady Eileen could see to that. Young people, uncritical, and with no idea of politics." "A Bundle would attend to that all right, I'm sure." "I wonder now." Lomax seemed struck by an idea. "You remember the matter I was speaking about just now?" "Oh, you've been speaking about so many things." No, I mean this unfortunate contretemps." He lowered his voice to a mysterious whisper. "The memoirs. Count Stilptich's memoirs." I think you're wrong about that," said Lord Caterham, suppressing a yawn. "People like scandal. Damn it all, I read reminiscences myself. Enjoy 'em too." "The point is not whether people will read them or not. They'll read them fast enough, but their publication at this juncture might ruin everything. Everything. The people of Czechoslovakia wish to restore the monarchy, and are prepared to offer the crown to Prince Michael, who has the support and encouragement of His Majesty's government, and who is prepared to grant concessions to Mr. Isaacstein and Co. in return for the loan of $1 million or so to set him on the throne." Caterham, implored Lomax in an agonized whisper. "Discretion, I beg of you. Above all things, discretion." "And the point is," continued Lord Caterham with some relish, though he lowered his voice in obedience to the other's appeal, "that some of Stilptich's reminiscences may upset the apple cart, tyranny and misbehaviour of the Abolovitch family generally, Questions asked in the House, why replace the present broad-minded and democratic form of government by an obsolete tyranny? Policy dictated by the blood-sucking capitalists, down with the government, that kind of thing, Lomax nodded. "And there might be worse still," he breathed. "Suppose, only suppose, that some reference should be made to that unfortunate disappearance. You know what I mean?" Lord Caterham stared at him. "No, I don't. What disappearance?" "Well, you must have heard of it. Why, it happened while they were at Chimneys. Henry was terribly upset about it. It almost ruined his career." "You interest me enormously," said Lord Caterham. "Who or what disappeared?" Lomax leant forward and put his mouth to Lord Caterham's ear. The latter withdrew it hastily. "For God's sake, don't hiss at me." "You heard what I said?" "Yes, I did," said Lord Caterham reluctantly. "I remember now, hearing something about it at the time. Very curious affair. I wonder who did it. It was never recovered?" "Never. Of course, we had to go about the matter with the utmost discretion. No hint of the loss could be allowed to leak out. But Stilptich was there at the time. He knew something. Not all, but something. We were at loggerheads with him once or twice over the Turkish question. Suppose that in sheer malice He has set the whole thing down for the world to read. Think of the scandal, of the far-reaching results. Everyone would say, why was it hushed up? Well, of course they would, said Lord Caterham, with evident enjoyment. Lomax, whose voice had risen to a high pitch, took a grip on himself. I must keep calm, he murmured. I must keep calm. But I ask you this, my dear fellow. If he didn't mean mischief, why did he send the manuscript to London in this roundabout way? It's odd, certainly. You are sure of your facts? Absolutely. We had our agents in Paris. The memoirs were conveyed away secretly some weeks before his death. Yes, it looks as though there's something in it, said Lord Caterham, with the same relish he had displayed before. We've found that they were sent to a man called Jimmy, or James McGrath, a Canadian at present in Africa. Quite an imperial affair, isn't it? Said Lord Caterham cheerily. James McGrath is due to arrive by the Granarth Castle tomorrow, Thursday. What are you going to do about it? We shall, of course, approach him at once, point out the possible serious consequences, and beg him to defer publication of the memoirs for at least a month, and in any case to permit them to be judiciously edited. Supposing that he says, no, sir, or I'll Goddard will see you in hell first, or something bright and breezy like that, suggested Lord Caterham. That's just what I'm afraid of, said Lomax simply. That's why it suddenly occurred to me that it might be a good thing to ask him down to Chimneys as well. He'd be flattered, naturally, at being asked to meet Prince Michael, and it might be easier to handle him. I'm not going to do it, said Lord Caterham hastily. I don't get on with Canadians. Never did, especially those that have lived much in Africa. Oh, you'll probably find him a splendid fellow. A rough diamond, you know. No, Lomax, I put my foot down there absolutely. Somebody else has got to tackle him. It has occurred to me, said Lomax, that a woman might be very useful here. Told enough and not too much, you understand? A woman could handle the whole thing delicately and with tact. Put the position before him, as it were, without getting his back up. Not that I approve of women in politics. St. Stephen's is ruined, absolutely ruined nowadays, but woman, in her own sphere, can do wonders. Or look at Henry's wife. What she did for him. Marcia was magnificent, unique, perfect political hostess. Oh, you don't want to ask Marcia down for this party, do you? Asked Lord Caterham faintly, turning a little pale at the mention of his redoubtable sister-in-law. No, you misunderstand me. I was speaking of the influence of women in general. No, I suggest a young woman, a woman of charm, beauty, intelligence. Oh, not Bundle. Bundle would be no use at all. She's a red-hot socialist, if she's anything at all, and she'd simply scream with laughter at the suggestion. I was not thinking of Lady Eileen. Your daughter, Caterham, is charming, simply charming, but quite a child. We need someone with savoir-faire, poise, knowledge of the world. Ah! Of course, the very person. My cousin Virginia. Oh, Mrs. Revel? Lord Caterham brightened up. He began to feel that he might possibly enjoy the party after all. A very good suggestion of yours, Lomax. The most charming woman in London. She's well up on Herzegovinian affairs, too. Her husband was at the embassy there, you remember. And as you say, a woman of great personal charm. A delightful creature, murmured Lord Caterham. That is settled, then. Mr. Lomax relaxed his hold on Lord Caterham's lapel, and the latter was quick to avail himself of the chance. Bye-bye, Lomax. You'll make all the arrangements, won't you? He dived into a taxi. As far as it is possible for one upright Christian gentleman to dislike another upright Christian gentleman, Lord Caterham disliked the Honourable George Lomax. He disliked his puffy red face, his heavy breathing, and his prominent earnest blue eyes. He thought of the coming weekend and sighed. A nuisance, an abominable nuisance. Then he thought of Virginia Revel, and cheered up a little. A delightful creature, he murmured to himself, a most delightful creature. Chapter 4. Introducing a very charming lady. George Lomax returned straight away to Whitehall. As he entered the sumptuous apartment in which he transacted affairs of state, there was a scuffling sound. Mr. Bill Eversley was assiduously filing letters, but a large armchair near the window was still warm from contact with a human form. A very likeable young man, Bill Eversley. Age, at a guess, 25, big and rather ungainly in his movements, a pleasantly ugly face, a splendid set of white teeth, and a pair of honest brown eyes. "Richardson sent up that report yet?" "No, sir. Shall I get on to him about it?" "It doesn't matter. Any telephone messages?" "Miss Oscar is dealing with most of them. Mr. Isaacstein wants to know if you can lunch with him at the Savoy tomorrow." "Tell Miss Oscar to look at my engagement book. If I'm not engaged, she can ring up and accept." "Yes, sir." By the way, Eversley, you might ring up a number for me now. Look it up in the book. Mrs. Revel, 487 Pont Street." "Yes, sir." Bill seized the telephone book, ran an unseeing eye down a column of M's, shut the book with a bang, and moved to the instrument on the desk. With his hand upon it, he paused, as though in sudden recollection. "Oh, I say, sir, I've just remembered. Her line's out of order. Mrs. Revel's, I mean. I was trying to ring her up just now." George Lomax frowned. "Annoying," he said. "Distinctly annoying." He tapped the table undecidedly. "If it's anything important, sir, perhaps I might go round there now in a taxi. She's sure to be in at this time in the morning." George Lomax hesitated, pondering the matter. Bill waited expectantly, poised for instant flight, should the reply be favourable. "Well, perhaps that would be the best plan," said Lomax at last. "Very well, then. Take a taxi there, and ask Mrs. Revel if she will be at home this afternoon at 4 o'clock, as I am very anxious to see her about an important matter." "Right, sir." Bill seized his hat and departed. 10 minutes later, a taxi deposited him at 487 Pont Street. He rang the bell and executed a loud rat-tat on the knocker. The door was opened by a grave functionary to whom Bill nodded with the ease of long acquaintance. "Morning, Chilvers. Mrs. Revel in?" "I believe, sir, that she is just going out." "Is that you, Bill?" called a voice over the banisters. "I thought I recognized that muscular knock. Come up and talk to me." Bill looked up at the face that was laughing down on him, and which was always inclined to reduce him, and not him alone, to a state of babbling incoherency. He took the stairs 2 at a time, and clasped Virginia Revel's outstretched hands tightly in his. "Hello, Virginia." "Hello, Bill." Charm is a very peculiar thing. Hundreds of young women, some of them more beautiful than Virginia Revel, might have said, "Hello, Bill," with exactly the same intonation, and yet have produced no effect whatsoever. But these 2 simple words, uttered by Virginia, had the most intoxicating effect upon Bill. Virginia Revel was just 27. She was tall, and of an exquisite slimness. Indeed, a poem might have been written to her slimness, it was so exquisitely proportioned. Her hair was of real bronze, with the greenish tint in its gold. She had a determined little chin, a lovely nose, slanting blue eyes that showed a gleam of deepest cornflower between the half-closed lids, and a delicious and quite indescribable mouth that tilted ever so slightly at one corner in what is known as the signature of Venus. It was a wonderfully expressive face, and there was a sort of radiant vitality about her that always challenged attention. It would have been quite impossible ever to ignore Virginia Revel. She drew Bill into the small drawing-room, which was all pale mauve and green and yellow, like crocuses surprised in a meadow. "Bill, darling," said Virginia, "isn't the Foreign Office missing you? I thought they couldn't get on without you." "I've brought a message for you from Codders." Thus irreverently did Bill allude to his chief. "And by the way, Virginia, in case he asks, remember that your telephone was out of order this morning." "But it hasn't been." "I know that, but I said it was." "Why? Enlighten me as to this Foreign Office touch." Bill threw her a reproachful glance. "Well, so that I could get here and see you, of course." "Oh, darling Bill, how dense of me, and how perfectly sweet of you." "Chilvers said you were going out." "So I was, to Sloane Street. There's a place there where they've got a perfectly wonderful new hip band." "A hip band?" Yes, Bill. HIP, hip, BAND, band. A band to confine the hips. You wear it next to the skin. I blush for you, Virginia. You shouldn't describe your underwear to a young man to whom you're not related. It isn't delicate. But, Bill, dear, there's nothing indelicate about hips. We've all got hips, although we poor women are trying awfully hard to pretend we haven't. This hip band is made of red rubber and comes to just above the knees, and it's simply impossible to walk in. How awful, said Bill. Why do you do it? Oh, because it gives one such a noble feeling to suffer for one's silhouette. But don't let's talk about my hip band. Give me George's message. He wants to know whether you'll be in at 4 o'clock this afternoon. I shan't. I shall be at Ranelagh. Why this sort of formal call? Is he going to propose to me, do you think? I shouldn't wonder. Because if so, you can tell him that I much prefer men who propose on impulse. Like me. It's not an impulse with you, Bill. It's habit. Virginia, won't you ever— No, Bill. I won't have it in the morning before lunch. Do try and think of me as a nice motherly person approaching middle age who has your interests thoroughly at heart. Virginia, I do love you so. I know, Bill, I know, and I simply love being loved. Isn't it wicked and dreadful of me? I should like every nice man in the world to be in love with me. Most of them are, I expect, said Bill gloomily, but I hope George isn't in love with me. I don't think he can be. He's so wedded to his career. What else did he say? Just that it was very important. Bill, I'm getting intrigued. The things that George thinks are important are so awfully limited. I think I must chuck Ranelagh. After all, I can go to Ranelagh any day. Tell George that I shall be awaiting him meekly at 4 o'clock. Bill looked at his wristwatch. It seems hardly worthwhile to go back before lunch. Come out and chew something, Virginia. I'm going out to lunch somewhere or other. Well, that doesn't matter. Make a day of it and chuck everything all around. It would be rather nice, said Virginia, smiling at him. Virginia, you're a darling. Tell me, you do like me rather, don't you? Better than other people? Bill, I adore you. If I had to marry someone, simply had to. I mean, if it was in a book and a wicked mandarin said to me, marry someone or die by slow torture, I should choose you at once. I should indeed. I should say, give me little Bill. Well then. Yes, but I haven't got to marry anyone. I love being a wicked widow. You could do all the same things still, go about and all that. You'd hardly notice me about the house. Bill, you don't understand. I'm the kind of person who marries enthusiastically, if they marry at all. Bill gave a hollow groan. I shall shoot myself one of these days, I expect, he murmured gloomily. No, you won't, Bill, darling. You'll take a pretty girl out to supper, like you did the night before last. Mr. Eversley was momentarily confused. If you mean Dorothy Kirkpatrick, the girl who's in Hooks and Eyes, well, dash it all, she's a thoroughly nice girl, straight as they make 'em. There was no harm in it. Bill, darling, of course there wasn't. I love you to enjoy yourself. But don't pretend to be dying of a broken heart, that's all. Mr. Eversley recovered his dignity. You don't understand at all, Virginia, he said severely. Men are polygamous. I know they are. Sometimes I have a shrewd suspicion that I am polyandrous. If you really love me, Bill, take me out to lunch quickly. Chapter 5. First Night in London. There is often a flaw in the best-laid plans. George Lomax had made one mistake. There was a weak spot in his preparations. The weak spot was Bill. Bill Eversley was an extremely nice lad. He was a good cricketer and a scratch golfer. He had pleasant manners and an amiable disposition. But his position in the Foreign Office had been gained not by brains, but by good connections. For the work he had to do, he was quite suitable. He was more or less George's dog. He did no responsible or brainy work. His part was to be constantly at George's elbow, to interview unimportant people whom George didn't want to see, to run errands, and generally to make himself useful. All this Bill carried out faithfully enough. When George was absent, Bill stretched himself out in the biggest chair and read the sporting news, and in so doing he was merely carrying out a time-honoured tradition. Being accustomed to send Bill on errands, George had dispatched him to the Union Castle offices to find out when the Granarth Castle was due in. Now, in common with most well-educated young Englishmen, Bill had a pleasant enough voice, but a tendency to mispronounce words that were not immediately familiar to him. Any elocution master would have found fault with his pronunciation of the word Granarth. It might have been anything. The clerk took it to be Carnfray. The Carnfray Castle was due in on the following Thursday. He said so. Bill thanked him and went out. George Lomax accepted the information and laid his plans accordingly. He knew nothing about Union Castle liners and took it for granted that James McGrath would duly arrive on Thursday. Therefore, at the moment he was buttonholing Lord Caterham on the steps of the club on Wednesday morning, he would have been greatly surprised to learn that the Granarth Castle had docked at Southampton the preceding afternoon. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, Anthony Cade, travelling under the name of Jimmy McGrath, stepped out of the boat train at Waterloo, hailed a taxi, and after a moment's hesitation ordered the driver to proceed to the Blitz Hotel. "One might as well be comfortable," said Anthony to himself as he looked with some interest out of the taxi windows. It was exactly 14 years since he had been in London. He arrived at the hotel, booked a room, and then went for a short stroll along the Embankment. It was rather pleasant to be back in London again. Everything was changed, of course. There had been a little restaurant there, just past Blackfriars Bridge, where he had dined fairly often, in company with other earnest lads. He had been a socialist then, and worn a flowing red tie. Young, very young. He retraced his steps back to the Blitz. Just as he was crossing the road, a man jostled against him, nearly making him lose his balance. They both recovered themselves, and the man muttered an apology, his eyes scanning Anthony's face narrowly. He was a short, thick-set man of the working classes, with something foreign in his appearance. Anthony went on into the hotel, wondering as he did so what had inspired that searching glance. Nothing in it, probably. The deep tan of his face was somewhat unusual-looking amongst these pallid Londoners, and it had attracted the fellow's attention. He went up to his room and, led by a sudden impulse, crossed to the looking-glass and stood studying his face in it. Of the few friends of the old days, just a chosen few, was it likely that any of them would recognize him now if they were to meet him face to face? He shook his head slowly. When he had left London, he had been just 18, a fair, slightly chubby boy with a misleadingly seraphic expression. Small chance that that boy would be recognized in the lean, brown-faced man with the quizzical expression. The telephone beside the bed rang, and Anthony crossed to the receiver. "Hello?" The voice of the desk clerk answered him. "Mr. James McGrath?" "Speaking. A gentleman has called to see you." Anthony was rather astonished. "To see me?" "Yes, sir. A foreign gentleman." "Oh, what's his name?" There was a slight pause, and then the clerk said, "I will send up a page boy with his card." Anthony replaced the receiver and waited. In a few minutes there was a knock on the door, and a small page appeared bearing a card upon a salver. Anthony took it. The following was the name engraved upon it: Baron Lola Precil. He now fully appreciated the desk clerk's pause. For a moment or two he stood studying the card, and then made up his mind. "Show the gentleman up." "Very good, sir." In a few minutes, the Baron Lola Precil was ushered into the room. A big man with an immense, fan-like black beard and a high, bald forehead. He brought his heels together with a click and bowed. "Mr. McGrath," he said. Anthony imitated his movements as nearly as possible. "Baron," he said. Then, drawing forward a chair, "Pray sit down. I have not, I think, had the pleasure of meeting you before." "That is so," agreed the Baron, seating himself. "It is my misfortune," he added politely. "And mine also," responded Anthony, on the same note. "Let us now to business come," said the Baron. "I represent in London the Loyalist party of Czechoslovakia." "And represent it admirably, I'm sure," murmured Anthony. The Baron bowed in acknowledgement of the compliment. "You are too kind," he said stiffly. "Mr. McGrath, I will not from you conceal anything. The moment has come for the restoration of the monarchy, in abeyance since the martyrdom of His Most Gracious Majesty King Nicholas IV, of blessed memory." "Amen," murmured Antony. "I mean, hear, hear." "On the throne will be placed His Highness Prince Michael, who the support of the British government has." "Splendid," said Antony. "It's very kind of you to tell me all this." "Everything arranged is, when you come here to trouble make." The Baron fixed him with a stern eye. "My dear Baron," protested Antony. Yes, I know what I'm talking about. You have with you the memoirs of the late Count Stilptich." He fixed Antony with an accusing eye. "And if I have? What have the memoirs of Count Stilptich to do with Prince Michael?" "They will cause scandals." "Well, most memoirs do that," said Antony soothingly. "Of many secrets he the knowledge had. Should he reveal but the quarter of them, Europe into war plunged may be." Come, said Antony. "It can't be as bad as all that." "An unfavourable opinion of the Obolovitch will abroad be spread. So democratic is the English spirit." "I can quite believe," said Antony, "that the Obolovitch may have been a trifle high-handed now and again. It runs in the blood. But people in England expect that sort of thing from the Balkans. I don't know why they should, but they do." "You do not understand," said the Baron. "You do not understand at all, and my lips sealed are." He sighed. "What exactly are you afraid of?" asked Antony. "Until I have read the memoirs, I do not know," explained the Baron simply, "but there is sure to be something. These great diplomats are always indiscreet. The apple cart upset will be, as the saying goes." "Look here," said Antony kindly, "I'm sure you're taking altogether too pessimistic a view of the thing. I know all about publishers. They sit on manuscripts and hatch 'em like eggs. It will be at least a year before the thing is published." "Either a very deceitful or a very simple young man you are. All is arranged for the memoirs in a Sunday newspaper to come out immediately." "Oh," Antony was somewhat taken aback. "But you can always deny everything," he said hopefully. The Baron shook his head sadly. No, through the hat you talk. Let us to business come. £1,000 you are to have, is it not? You see, I have the good information got." "I certainly congratulate the intelligence department of the Loyalists." "Then I to you offer 1,500. Antony stared at him in amazement, then shook his head ruefully. "I'm afraid it can't be done," he said with regret. "Good. I to you offer 2,000. "You tempt me, Baron, you tempt me, but I still say it can't be done." "Your own price name, then." "I'm afraid you don't understand the position. I'm perfectly willing to believe that you're on the side of the angels, and that these memoirs may damage your cause. Nevertheless, I've undertaken the job, and I've got to carry it through, see? I can't allow myself to be bought off by the other side. That kind of thing isn't done." The Baron listened very attentively. At the end of Antony's speech, he nodded his head several times. "I see. Your honour as an Englishman it is." "Well, we don't put it that way ourselves," said Antony, "but I dare say, allowing for a difference in vocabulary, that we both mean much the same thing." The Baron rose to his feet. "For the English honour, I much respect have," he announced. "We must try another way. I wish you good morning." He drew his heels together, clicked, bowed, and marched out of the room, holding himself stiffly erect. "Now I wonder what he meant by that," mused Antony. "Was it a threat? Not that I'm in the least afraid of old Lollipop. Rather a good name for him, that, by the way. I shall call him Baron Lollipop." He took a turn or two up and down the room, undecided on his next course of action. The date stipulated upon for delivering the manuscript was a little over a week ahead. Today was the 5th of October. Antony had no intention of handing it over before the last moment. Truth to tell, he was by now feverishly anxious to read these memoirs. He had meant to do so on the boat coming over, but had been laid low with a touch of fever and not at all in the mood for deciphering crabbed and illegible handwriting, for none of the manuscript was typed. He was now more than ever determined to see what all the fuss was about. There was the other job, too. On an impulse, he picked up the telephone book and looked up the name of Revel. There were 6 Revels in the book: Edward Henry Revel, a surgeon, of Harley Street, and James Revel and Co., saddlers. Lennox Revel, of Abbottbury Mansions, Hampstead, Miss Mary Revel, with an address in Ealing, the Honourable Mrs. Timothy Revel, of 487 Pont Street, and Mrs. Willis Revel, of 42 Cadogan Square. Eliminating the saddlers and Miss Mary Revel, that gave him 4 names to investigate, and there was no reason to suppose that the lady lived in London at all. He shut up the book with a short shake of the head. "For the moment, I'll leave it to chance," he said. "Something usually turns up." The luck of the Anthony Cades of this world is perhaps in some measure due to their own belief in it. Anthony found what he was after not half an hour later, when he was turning over the pages of an illustrated paper. It was a representation of some tableau organised by the Duchess of Perth. Below the central figure, a woman in Eastern dress, was the inscription, "The Honourable Mrs. Timothy Revel as Cleopatra." Before her marriage, Mrs. Revel was the Honourable Virginia Cawthron, a daughter of Lord Edgbaston. Anthony looked at the picture some time, slowly pursing up his lips as though to whistle. Then he tore out the whole page, folded it up and put it in his pocket. He went upstairs again, unlocked his suitcase, and took out the packet of letters. He took out the folded page from his pocket and slipped it under the string that held them together. Then, at a sudden sound behind him, he wheeled round sharply. A man was standing in the doorway, the kind of man whom Anthony had fondly imagined existed only in the chorus of a comic opera. A sinister-looking figure, with a squat, brutal head and lips drawn back in an evil grin. "What the devil are you doing here?" asked Anthony, "and who let you come up?" "I pass where I please," said the stranger. His voice was guttural and foreign, though his English was idiomatic enough. "Well, get out, do you hear?" Anthony went on. The man's eyes were fixed on the packet of letters which Anthony had caught up. "I will get out when you have given me what I have come for." "And what is that, may I ask?" The man took a step nearer. "The memoirs of Count Stiltich," he hissed. "It's impossible to take you seriously," said Anthony. "You're so completely the stage villain. I like your get-up very much. Who sent you here? Baron Lollipop?" "Baron—" The man jerked out a string of harsh-sounding consonants. "So, that's how you pronounce it, is it? A cross between gargling and barking like a dog. I don't think I could say it myself. My throat's not made that way. I shall have to go on calling him Lollipop. So he sent you, did he?" But he received a vehement negative. His visitor went so far as to spit upon the suggestion in a very realistic manner. Then he drew from his pocket a sheet of paper which he threw upon the table. "Look," he said. "Look and tremble, accursed Englishman." Anthony looked with some interest, not troubling to fulfill the latter part of the command. On the paper was traced the crude design of a human hand in red. "It looks like a hand," he remarked. "But if you say so, I'm quite prepared to admit that it's a cubist picture of sunset at the North Pole." "It is the sign of the Comrades of the Red Hand. I am a comrade of the Red Hand." "You don't say so," said Anthony, looking at him with much interest. "Are the others all like you? I don't know what the Eugenic Society would have to say about it." The man snarled angrily. "Dog," he said. "Worse than dog. Paid slave of an effete monarchy. Give me the memoirs, and you shall go unscathed. Such is the clemency of the Brotherhood." "It's very kind of them, I'm sure," said Anthony, "but I'm afraid that both they and you are labouring under a misapprehension. My instructions are to deliver the manuscript not to your amiable society, but to a certain firm of publishers." "Pah!" laughed the other. "Do you think you will ever be permitted to reach that office alive? Enough of this fool's talk. Hand over the papers, or I shoot." He drew a revolver from his pocket and brandished it in the air. But there he misjudged this Anthony Cade. He was not used to men who could act as quickly, or rather quicker, than they could think. Anthony did not wait to be covered by the revolver. Almost as soon as the other had got it out of his pocket, Anthony had sprung forward and knocked it out of his hand. The force of the blow sent the man swinging round so that he presented his back to his assailant. The chance was too good to be missed. With one mighty, well-directed kick, Anthony sent the man flying through the doorway into the corridor, where he collapsed in a heap. Anthony stepped out after him, but the doughty comrade of the Red Hand had had enough. He got nimbly to his feet and fled down the passage. Anthony did not pursue him, but went back into his own room. "So much for the comrades of the Red Hand," he remarked. "Picturesque appearance, but easily routed by direct action. How the hell did that fellow get in, I wonder? There's one thing that stands out pretty clearly. This isn't going to be quite such a soft job as I thought. I've already fallen foul of both the Loyalist and the Revolutionary parties. Soon, I suppose, the Nationalists and the Independent Liberals will be sending up a delegation. One thing's fixed. I start on that manuscript tonight." Looking at his watch, Anthony discovered that it was nearly 9 o'clock, and he decided to dine where he was. He did not anticipate any more surprise visits, but he felt that it was up to him to be on his guard. He had no intention of allowing his suitcase to be rifled whilst he was downstairs in the grill-room. He rang the bell and asked for the menu, selected a couple of dishes, and ordered a bottle of Chambertin. The waiter took the order and withdrew. Whilst he was waiting for the meal to arrive, he got out the package of manuscript and put it on the table with the letters. There was a knock at the door, and the waiter entered with a small table and the accessories of the meal. Anthony had strolled over to the mantelpiece. Standing there with his back to the room, he was directly facing the mirror, and idly glancing in it, he noticed a curious thing. The waiter's eyes were glued on the parcel of manuscript, shooting little glances sideways at Anthony's immovable back. He moved softly round the table. His hands were twitching, and he kept passing his tongue over his dry lips. Anthony observed him more closely. He was a tall man, supple, like all waiters, with a clean-shaven, mobile face. An Italian, Anthony thought, not a Frenchman. At the critical moment, Anthony wheeled round abruptly. The waiter started slightly, but pretended to be doing something with the salt cellar. "What's your name?" asked Anthony abruptly. "Giuseppe, monsieur." "Italian, eh?" "Yes, monsieur." Anthony spoke to him in that language, and the man answered fluently enough. Finally, Anthony dismissed him with a nod. But all the while he was eating the excellent meal which Giuseppe served him, he was thinking rapidly. Had he been mistaken? Was Giuseppe's interest in the parcel just ordinary curiosity? It might be so. But remembering the feverish intensity of the man's excitement, Anthony decided against that theory. All the same, he was puzzled. "Dash it all," said Anthony to himself, "everyone can't be after the blasted manuscript. Perhaps I'm fancying things." Dinner concluded and cleared away, he applied himself to the perusal of the memoirs. Owing to the illegibility of the late Count's handwriting, the business was a slow one. Anthony's yawns succeeded one another with suspicious rapidity. At the end of the 4th chapter, he gave it up. So far, he had found the memoirs insufferably dull, with no hint of scandal of any kind. He gathered up the letters and the wrappings of the manuscript which were lying in a heap together on the table and locked them up in the suitcase. Then he locked the door, and, as an additional precaution, put a chair against it. On the chair he placed the water bottle from the bathroom. Surveying these preparations with some pride, he undressed and got into bed. He had one more shot at the Count's memoirs, but felt his eyelids drooping, and stuffing the manuscript under his pillow, he switched out the light and fell asleep almost immediately. It must have been some 4 hours later that he awoke with a start. What had awakened him he did not know, perhaps a sound, perhaps only the consciousness of danger, which in men who have led an adventurous life is very fully developed. For a moment he lay quite still, trying to focus his impressions. He could hear a very stealthy rustle, and then he became aware of a denser blackness somewhere between him and the window, on the floor by the suitcase. With a sudden spring, Anthony jumped out of bed, switching on the light as he did so. A figure sprang up from where it had been kneeling by the suitcase. It was the waiter, Giuseppe. In his right hand gleamed a long, thin knife. He hurled himself straight upon Anthony, who was by now fully conscious of his own danger. He was unarmed, and Giuseppe was evidently thoroughly at home with his own weapon. Anthony sprang to one side, and Giuseppe missed him with the knife. The next minute the two men were rolling on the floor together, locked in a close embrace. The whole of Anthony's faculties were centred upon keeping a close grip of Giuseppe's right arm, so that he would be unable to use the knife. He bent it slowly back. At the same time he felt the Italian's other hand clutching at his windpipe, stifling him, choking, and still, desperately, he bent the right arm back. There was a sharp tinkle as the knife fell on the floor. At the same time the Italian extricated himself with a swift twist from Anthony's grasp. Anthony sprang up too, but made the mistake of moving towards the door to cut off the other's retreat. He saw, too late, that the chair and the water bottle were just as he had arranged them. Giuseppe had entered by the window, and it was the window he made for now. In the instant's respite given him by Anthony's move towards the door, he had sprung out on the balcony, leapt over to the adjoining balcony, and had disappeared through the adjoining window. Anthony knew well enough that it was of no use to pursue him. His way of retreat was doubtless fully assured. Anthony would merely get himself into trouble. He walked over to the bed, thrusting his hand beneath the pillow and drawing out the memoirs. Lucky that they had been there and not in the suitcase. He crossed over to the suitcase and looked inside, meaning to take out the letters. Then he swore softly under his breath. The letters were gone.
This is end of part 1. There are 7 parts of this audiobook. Please click on the link on the screen to listen to part 2 of 7.